accidentally took people's medicine. You might need that.
2024, an election year like no other. From the candidates to the issues, from voter integrity and analysis, we'll discuss debates, trends, patterns, election laws, and more. This is Vote 2024, Path to the Polls.
Kamala Harris chooses a running mate, and it's Minnesota's governor, Tim Walz. In choosing Walz, she's turning to a Midwestern governor, military veteran, and union supporter who helped enact an ambitious Democratic agenda for his state, including sweeping protections for abortion rights and generous aid to families. We'll talk about what he brings to the race. Also, Florida's role in the run for the White House. Florida's been a losing proposition for Democrats since 2012 when Barack Obama won. The losing streak has been pretty well sustained for the past 12 years, with the Dems blaming demographic changes or rising political stars for changing the state from a battleground to purple and then deep red. Enter Vice President Kamala Harris, and boom, there's a new enthusiasm nationwide among Democrats. And in many corners, if you believe the polls, she's tightened the race against Donald Trump. Even here in Florida, the jolt's being felt from Miami to Jacksonville and across the Panhandle to Tallahassee. But, and yes, there is a but, while Harris may have energized the state's Democratic base, there's not enough evidence suggesting she's changed voter preferences in the state. Not if the latest poll from the UNF Opinion Research Lab is any indication. Now, keep in mind, it's the first poll since President Biden decided to drop out of the race. Also, be mindful of the fact that it's Donald Trump's home state. Talk to Florida Dems like Congressman Maxwell Frost of Orlando, and they'll tell you Florida is already in play. Just a talking point? Time will tell. Don't lose sight of the fact that what happens in Florida over the next 3+ months will test the Republicans' hold on a state of more than 23 million people. It has become a reliable source of electoral votes for former President Trump and the GOP. Democrats are already hoping to see a turnout boost from a pair of November ballot measures that would overturn the state's ban on abortion after 6 weeks and legalize marijuana for adults. Welcome to Path to the Polls. I'm Bruce Hamilton. Joining me is Dr. Michael Binder, director of the University of North Florida's Public Opinion Research Lab. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Bruce.
So let's start with the news that broke Tuesday morning about the Minnesota governor rounding out the Harris ticket. Harris, no doubt, hopes to shore up her campaign standing across the upper Midwest, a critical region in presidential politics that often serves as a buffer to Democrats seeking the White House. Party remains haunted by Trump's wins in Michigan and Wisconsin in, what was it, 2016? Trump lost those states in 2020, but zeroed in on them as he aims to return to the presidency this year and is expanding his focus to Minnesota. This choice provides strength to the ticket?
Well, it certainly provides a different perspective and a balance, if you will, right? A California prosecutor versus a Minnesota governor, different part of the country, different background, obviously a white male, so there's a different demographics to this pick. And certainly he can point to his record in Minnesota for getting things done that would be considered more progressive, and that's something that they can lean on in the Midwest, particularly those states you mentioned, right? Your Michigans, your Wisconsins, and even your Pennsylvanias to some extent.
He is also the first to call Trump weird, which has become kind of a rallying point for the Democrats. That might be the new campaign slogan, and it's kind of caught on.
I mean, it's ironic in that, Donald Trump has been expert over the last decade or so at nicknames and belittling his political opponents. And folks have tried, and they've whiffed dramatically. But this little weird bit seems to be sticking a little bit. And there's some, those things that have a little bit of kernel of truth to them tend to kind of go the furthest in these types of circumstances.
All right, let's get to the latest polling that you did. The survey of likely Florida voters from the University of North Florida's Public Opinion Research Lab shows that Donald Trump is ahead of Harris by a robust 7-point margin, 49% to 42%. Not a surprise to you.
No, not a surprise. And this is Florida. And as we've talked about over not just the opening of this program, but in the past couple of years, Florida's trending a little bit redder. We're not quite Alabama yet, but we're certainly much closer to Ohio. This is a circumstance where if the Republicans were to lose this race, I'd be very, very surprised.
That is larger than the margin he won the state by in 2020.
And part of that is the makeup of the state. We've evolved as a state in this terms of who's here, who's voting. If you look back to 2020, we were about +2 Democrat registration advantage, but currently we're up to +4 Republican registration advantage. That's a 6-point registration swing. That's an enormous number.
In the weeks since, Harris has gained quite a bit of momentum, raised a lot of campaign cash. And I mentioned that Florida Democrats, like Orlando's Congressman Maxwell Frost, said that Florida will be in play. In fact, he says it's already in play. Do you expect Harris to close that gap among Florida voters by the time you take the next poll, and certainly by November? And I could mention her choice of the Minnesota governor, but VP picks really don't change the equation by very much usually.
Yeah, maybe in their home state, maybe in a neighboring state. VP picks are on the margins. But like we've talked about, right, this could be a really close race in some states like in Michigan, and maybe 10,000 votes, that could make a difference. But as far as Florida's concerned, I'd be surprised. You might find a poll that has her a little bit closer. You might find a poll that has her a little bit further away. But I think it's going to be really, really difficult for her to not just kind of overcome the registration gap, but there tends to be historically a partisan turnout gap in Florida as well. Republicans, based on their demographics, are a little bit more likely to show up. So even with that registration advantage, the ones that they have are more likely to show up in November. So that even expands that gap further. So no, I'd be really, really surprised if this was truly in play for Harris in Florida.
Now, we do know that she's going to be courting the Black and Latino vote pretty aggressively here. Trump recently alienated a lot of people questioning Harris's Black heritage at the National Association of Black Journalists last week. A lot of people found his comments extremely offensive. That said, when you look at redistricting here in the state and concerns it caused among the Black electorate who already felt disenfranchised, might there be a groundswell of support for Harris to move the polls here?
I mean, there certainly could be. The problem is they're 13-14% of the electorate. There's just not enough of the Black and Democratic vote. If she were to sweep the Latino vote, which is particularly difficult, especially here in Florida with the heavy Cuban vote down in Miami, which tends to lean conservative, maybe there's room there. But she's really up against the demographic changes here in the state. We are so full of senior citizens that tend to be leaning Republican that's really tough to overcome.
The amendments could very well play a factor in this election and how things play out. Amendment 4 in Florida. It's the amendment to protect abortion access. Your polling shows an overwhelming majority, 69%, favor the measure, 23% are opposed. Michael, it needs 60% to pass, is the number. Congresswoman Lois Frankel of West Palm Beach said there's been an overwhelming groundswell of support across the country, in Florida, and in Palm Beach County, which is Trump's backyard, by the way, for this. Frankel said that in the United States, 1/3 of women of reproductive age now live in states with abortion bans, including 4 million in Florida. And the state's new restrictions are leading to dangerous miscarriages and 68,000 forced pregnancies. Something there might move the needle for the Harris team?
Well, I think they're going to try to, right? That's obviously an exceptionally important angle of attack for that team and for her candidacy. And they're using that not only to mobilize, but to potentially convince maybe some moderate Republicans who are looking around saying, this is really an important issue to me. But the ballot measure in and of itself, I don't think is going to generate a whole lot more turnout than you would have already gotten during a general election. There's no evidence, at least not in the political science world, that shows that these ballot measures really boost turnout in any meaningful way during general elections. Midterm elections, special elections, that's a different story. You can certainly see turnout boosts, but I don't see that really impacting the race for president or really even for the Senate race here in Florida. Now, does that 69% hold? Does that stay above 60 come November? That's an entirely different question. There's a number of committees that have been formed recently that look like they're ready to come out against this ballot measure and potentially have a little bit of resources. They're struggling to get money now, but if they come out and have some money to spend, you might expect that to tick down a little bit. But I think that, this groundswell that the Congresswoman was talking about, you can point to, the 6-week ban here in Florida and how maybe folks are looking around and say, listen, if they're not on one of the ends of the spectrum where it's 5% that's all on one side or 5% all on the other, everybody else is kind of in the middle. They might be looking around and saying, 6 weeks, depending upon how you measure a pregnancy, people don't even know they're pregnant yet. Like, that's a little quick on the turnaround. Maybe we can go back to this Roe v. Wade era. So I think that's probably what can attribute that recent bump in support for that amendment.
But you don't think women are going to sit back and say, look, women's rights are being attacked here, and we need to go to the polls beyond just this particular amendment?
Sure, but there's plenty of women that think this amendment's a great idea and that are exceptionally pro-life. Like, this is not a circumstance where all women are pro-choice. There's a lot of women on the pro-life side of the ledger that think the 6-week situation's great, and they're not in favor of Amendment 4.
How about this whole Project 2025 issue? I know Trump tried to distance himself from it, but it includes a nationwide ban on abortion. And no matter how hard he tries, it's people he's associated with that have been part and parcel of his whole White House. His neighbors in Palm Beach want nothing to do with it. How much of a factor might that be?
Well, I think it's an effort that Democrats are trying to pin on him for sure. And you're absolutely right? You are who you associate yourself with. And he is associated with authors of this and supporters of this Project 2025. Absolutely, 100%. The problem is, I'm not sure how much this has really penetrated the regular average voter. Yes, people that pay attention to this stuff on the daily, like you or like me, who do this for our jobs, we're steeped in this, we're fully aware of it, we know about it. Your average voter who maybe is just starting to pay attention and says, oh, wow, Biden dropped out. Yeah, I thought he was probably too old. And, Trump's a little bit, he's Trump and we're used to him for the last 10 years. I don't know that Project 2025 has really seeped into the public sphere as far as your average voter or maybe your undecided voter or something like that might come in and might make a play in one of these swing states, whether it's Michigan or Pennsylvania or Arizona come November.
You don't think people are going to sit back and say he's playing the same game he did back in 2016? He hasn't changed his game at all? He hasn't grown as a politician? Look, let me go back to what he said, before the National Association of Black Journalists. He continues to harp on that. And, we just had this big tanking of the stock market, and he could have moved with an economic message, but he didn't. He harps on the same old things. People aren't going to look at that and say, look, I'm affected by the economy, and he's not talking about that, something that hits home with me.
Yeah, listen, there are a ton of Republicans that wish he would stick to the talking points. They've been saying it for 10 years. He can't help himself. Sometimes people are who they are, and Donald Trump is who he is. And the benefit of that is he attracted a lot of new people to the Republican Party. He attracted a lot of new voters in 2016. The downside of that is, he's alienating large chunks of the traditional Republican Party. And for every person you alienate, you need to not only find somebody new to make up for that, but then you got to find somebody else to get back ahead of where you were when they were a Republican. So no, he's making it hard on himself, but this is who he is, and he's been this way. Having been from Jersey, I've known this guy my whole life in one form or another, whether it's a casino or development or anything of that nature. But this is who he is. He has been for most of his adult life. Now, I don't expect that to change between now and November.
And for most of the voters, what you're saying is it's Donald Trump being Donald Trump, and it's what we expect. All right, before I move on to the Senate race and some other things involving Florida in general, let me ask you about Amendment 3 to legalize recreational marijuana. Your UNF polling shows 64% of the respondents support the measure, 31% oppose it, 5% undecided, refuse to answer. Now, the 15 states that brought the issue of legalizing recreational cannabis to the voters, only 3 states have passed the measure by more than 60%, New Jersey, Maryland, and Arizona. Until recently, the organization supporting Amendment 3, Smart and Safe Florida, had no opposition as it raised more than $60 million in support of it. Earlier this month, Vote No on 3 was formed to oppose it. The Florida Police Chiefs Association recently announced their opposition. If they started spending cash, you expect those polling numbers might change and change significantly?
Significantly, no, but you don't need to change significantly in order to fall down to 59%. And that's the thing with Florida with these ballot measures. It is such a high bar. 60% is a very difficult number to get to. Yeah, the Florida sheriffs came out against this, but it's not unanimous, right? There are sheriffs that are on the record in support of it. But it's also true that there is money to be sent there. A billionaire hedge fund manager, Ken Griffin, indicated he's willing to dump $12 million into the No on 3 campaign. These are things that if you get a concerted effort against it, you could just pick out one little aspect that makes it difficult for these ballot measures to pass, because all you got to do is chip away a few percentage points. And think, 59% loses for both Amendment 3 and Amendment 4. But if you look back to 2022, Governor DeSantis won re-election with 59%, and he was calling it an epic landslide. So you can get an epic landslide and still lose at the ballot box, and that's what's difficult about these ballot measures.
True there. Coming up on Path to the Polls, how crucial is Florida's role in the upcoming fight for the Oval Office? Well, the Sunshine State probably won't provide enough sunlight to give Harris a path to the White House, but the state can play an important role, for starters, in helping avoid what the Dems termed as disastrous midterms. Democratic efforts to turn a deep red state purple again. We'll take a look at that and the U.S. Senate race, which is crucially important nationally because it plays to the balance of power in Washington. That and more when Path to the Polls continues.
Ashley, is there a different kind of workers' comp you can call?
Out 700. Like I told Lexi, I'm out $700.
That's what I said. I said Ashley needs to look for a different kind of workers' comp. $700.
Yeah.
Is this my phone?
Welcome back to Path to the Polls. Bruce Hamilton. My guest is Dr. Michael Binder, director of the University of North Florida Public Opinion Research Lab. Michael, in Congress, the Senate majority is on the line, and Democrats are targeting GOP strongholds in both Texas and here in Florida. And that's why the race between incumbent Rick Scott and Debbie Mucarsel-Powell is getting so much attention. Two recent polls show Scott losing ground, including the latest UNF poll. Looking at the numbers, Scott topped the former Democratic Congresswoman from Miami, who must still win the party's primary in August by just 4 percentage points, 47% to 43%. Again, the second consecutive poll that shows him losing ground. When you factor in the margin of error, it's basically a statistical tie. A lot of people, Republicans included, who think Scott's positions are toxic, could cost him the election. He has pushed a national abortion ban, said he would support any anti-choice bill, wants to raise taxes on the middle class, but lower taxes on corporations and the wealthy. Even Mitch McConnell, who he wants to replace, by the way, as Senate Majority Leader, called Scott's signature plan a bad idea. Is he flirting with disaster here?
Well, I mean, Rick Scott has been in Florida politics for a good long time now and has won races by razor-thin margins regularly. So I would not, put the nail in this guy's coffin anytime soon. And that was a Florida that was much closer politically, as we talked about earlier. I think he's in a pretty good spot. I think you can always expect most Senate candidates to poll behind Trump and come in a little bit behind Trump. he brings a different perspective, and he gets votes that maybe other Republicans wouldn't, Rick Scott included. And so, yeah, I expect Scott to pull behind Trump, but I do expect Scott to win. Does that mean McCarcel Powell doesn't have a puncher's chance? Sure, she does. But I think I think she has a better chance to win than Harris does. But nonetheless, I still think that's a very uphill battle, and she needs a lot more resources and probably some more name recognition, too.
So let's talk about Florida as a whole. As I said at the top of the show, Florida has been a losing proposition for Democrats since 2012 when Obama won. Losing streak has been pretty well sustained for the past 12 years, with the Democrats blaming demographic changes or rising political stars for changing the state from a battleground to purple and then deep red. Kamala Harris is part of the equation now and energizing Democrats. Can she turn this deep red state, certainly not blue again, but maybe some sort of shade of purple?
I think maybe a shade of light red's your best chance, right? The last statewide person on the Democratic side to win was Nikki Fried back in 2018, and she ran on a pro-marijuana platform, and that was successful for her. But there hasn't been anything close since then. And the idea that this is going to be at least sort of interesting, I think speaks volumes to what the Harris campaign and what she has done for enthusiasm amongst Democrats here in Florida. But, and this is the key but, right? Yes, motivating young people is important. Yes, motivating people of color is important. All those things are meaningful. But Florida, we are full of senior citizens. We are full of senior citizens that vote. Old white people vote in this state, and they vote in big numbers, and you need to make inroads there, too.
And if nothing else, no doubt the party, the Democrats, would love to avoid a repeat of the disastrous midterms. They saw Democratic turnout plunge. DeSantis and other Republicans romped at the polls. You think Harris will make Democrats more enthusiastic, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, absolutely. 2022 was a exceptionally poor year for Democrats. They just didn't show up at the polls, and some of it's understandable, right? They had a guy at the top of the ticket running for governor who was a former Republican who didn't really mobilize that base at all. You've got the opposite of that. You've also got a general election. So there's a lot more going on. I would fully expect turnout to look more like it did in 2020 for Democrats than it did in 2022. And if they can get to that, maybe you could steal a congressional seat down south. Maybe you could take Luna's seat. That might be, probably not in play, but you never know. Those are some things that Democrats, their baseline for success is different than, let's say, winning the White House in Florida, at least at the top of the ticket, right? They're competing in all the congressional seats. I think that's a win. They're competing in a lot of statewide races, both state Senate and state House. Maybe they can pick off a couple of there. I think their goal is to try and get out of that supermajority situation that they're in both houses in Tallahassee. I think those would be big W's for the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I would think also they would want to send a message to Governor DeSantis and the state legislature about some of the laws that are being passed here as well, if they'd want to, have the Republicans release their stranglehold on what's happening here statewide.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of chipping away at that supermajority would help them dramatically. And also, right, listen, if you're DeSantis and you look around, I think a lot of his policies the last couple of years have not been geared toward Florida. They were geared toward Iowa. And it's not clear that he's not thinking about 2028 in Iowa again. So I think his perspective on what's happening in Florida might be a little bit different, but that would certainly get his attention if Democrats were to start picking off some House seats and some state Senate seats. And it might get some other people's attention in Tallahassee, too.
Yeah, and back to what's happening with the run for the White House, no doubt what happens in Florida over the next 3+ months will test Republicans' hold on a state of more than 23 million people, which has become a reliable source of electoral votes for the former president, Donald Trump, and the GOP.
Yeah, no, this is a red state. And, if they were to lose Florida, Republicans would get just trounced in this election. It's not quite the same as Democrats losing California or New York, but it's along those lines. This is a mandatory state for Republicans, and it's much closer to Ohio. Like this is we're a red state now. You know, I don't think we're Alabama deep red, but we're certainly not purple anymore.
And safe to say, something you've touched on is already, the Dems hope to see voter turnout boosted by the 2 amendments on the ballot we talked about to overturn the state's ban on abortion after 6 weeks and legalize marijuana for adults, though it remains to be seen whether those amendments will be enough.
Right, and I'm skeptical that they'll be enough. I certainly think they'll help it, and they'll get it back. They'll normalize it, if you will. They'll normalize turnout for Democrats. I just don't know that there's enough there. Now, it's also true that just because you're mobilized to go to the polls, either for Amendment 3, which is the marijuana, or Amendment 4, the abortion issue, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to vote Democrat at the top of the ticket, even if you're voting in favor of both of those amendments. You can be pro-recreational marijuana because you don't think government should interfere in your life at all and still pull the ticket for Republicans, right? You can be pro a Roe situation with abortion in Florida, but also pull the lever for Republicans across the state too. Those are not necessarily incompatible. So just because you show up doesn't mean it's going to automatically trickle up to the top of the ticket either.
And we can't ignore the fact that Harris is in a honeymoon period, and all this excitement could give way to shattered expectations, and that would do nothing more than move Florida away from being what it once was, a swing state.
Sure. Listen, oftentimes political debates don't really matter a whole lot. They make for great sound bites and a ton of news coverage for a day or two. But we learned in June that presidential debates can have immense impacts on outcomes. That debate pushed Biden out of the race. What Kamala Harris does in their first debate, and maybe their second or third debate, if it gets that far, will go a long way toward determining the narrative around her and what happens not only here in Florida, but across the country.
There is no crystal ball. Michael Binder, always appreciate your insights, your context, your perspective, and your focus, and certainly your time. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
For those of you who want to watch this again, an encore performance tonight at 7. You can always watch streaming on demand when you want on news4jax.com and the News4Jax YouTube channel. It's Past to the Polls. Appreciate you watching.
See why every day more people are choosing News4Jax, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.